Hello everybody, I'm your host, and today we're going to be taking a look at some truly terrifying stories from the series Frozen Nightmares. These are the most disturbing winter horror stories told to me by viewers like you. So let's get into it. First, we have to look at the vanishing hiker. A guy was out hiking one day in the middle of winter, and he decided to go off the beaten path. Bad idea because soon a massive blizzard came rolling in, and he became disoriented and lost. When his car was found, it was immediately obvious that he had gone missing. The authorities began searching right away, but conditions were so bad that they had to postpone the search until the next day. When they did go back, they found his tracks in the snow. They followed them for miles, but suddenly they just stopped. There was no sign of him anywhere. His tent wasn't pitched, nor was there any indication of where he could have gone. This man just vanished into thin air, and his disappearance remains unexplained to this day. Next, we have to look at the cabin in the woods. Two guys decided to head out to their friend's cabin in the woods. They hadn't seen each other since high school, so they wanted to catch up. But first, they had to get to the cabin. It was almost 3 hours in, and the GPS had died 2 hours ago. But finally, just as it was getting dark, they saw the lights of the cabin in the distance. They picked up the pace and made it to the door just as the snow was coming down hard. One of the guys knocked on the door, but it opened with ease. They walked in and looked around. Everything was dusty. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Then they heard a noise upstairs. They called out, but nobody answered. Then they heard it again. Footsteps. They followed the sound and began to walk up the stairs. But as they did, they noticed something. In the floorboard, there were massive footprints. They went up the stairs, but there were no footprints going down. As they walked around the house, they noticed more prints. All of them led to the door, but none of them left the house. Whoever was here never left. Next, we have to look at the ice fisherman's last catch. A group of friends decided to go ice fishing one day, but little did they know that one of them wouldn't be coming back. They drilled a hole in the ice and dropped their lines down in. It wasn't long before one of the guys got a bite. He pulled on his line, but whatever was on the other end was too big for him to handle. He looked over at his friends and asked them to help him pull in the line. Whatever was on the end of the line struggled and fought them the whole way, but eventually they got it up onto the ice. To their surprise, it was a large dog. The dog looked exhausted, but it was friendly. It licked the guys' faces and wagged its tail. Then it took off running across the ice. The friends watched as it disappeared in the distance. One of the guys thought it might have had an owner nearby, but after a while they decided to pack up and go home. On the way to their cars, they passed by the spot where they'd met the dog. There was a hole in the ice, and sticking out of it was a single red glove. The guys looked at each other. They all knew whose glove that was. They turned and ran to the nearest house, and what they saw in the distance made their blood run cold. It was the dog, but now it was dragging a body behind it. The ice fisherman had paid the ultimate price to save his dog. Next, we have to look at the snowplow incident. A woman was driving home late one night when her car broke down. She pulled over and turned on her hazard lights. Soon, she noticed a massive snowplow approaching. The plow was huge, and the bright lights blinded her. She watched as it approached and then hit her. Her windshield shattered, and she was covered in glass. She managed to crawl out of the car and stumble to the side of the road. She looked back and saw the plow had disappeared. She was in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was about 10 miles away. She managed to make it to the edge of the road, but then she collapsed. She woke up and saw a police car approaching. She flagged them down, and they asked her what had happened. She explained about the plow, and the police went to investigate. But when they returned, they had a grim look on their faces. The woman was confused, but the officer shook his head and said, "There was no plow here. You must have imagined it." The woman insisted she had been hit, but nobody believed her. When they searched the area, they didn't find any evidence of a crash. And as the sun came up, they realized why. The entire road had been plowed clean. But that wasn't the only thing they noticed. The woman had massive amounts of blood on her clothes. She hadn't been injured, But where did the blood come from? She didn't know. She agreed to go to the hospital for a checkup, but when the doctors examined her, they couldn't find a single scratch. The police returned to the scene and found bloody footprints in the snow. They followed them for a while, but then they disappeared. Wherever this woman had gone, it wasn't anywhere in the town. Next, we have to look at the phantom skier. One day at a ski resort, two skiers were cruising down the mountain when they saw something strange ahead. It was a person dressed in black from head to toe. They had a black helmet that covered their face and a long black coat. They were skiing very fast and weaving in and out of the trees. The skiers tried to get a better look, but as they got closer, the figure suddenly vanished into a whiteout. They looked around, but there was no sign of the skier. The two guys continued down the mountain, but then they heard a crash in the trees. They looked up and saw the skier tumbling down the hill. They raced over, and as they got close, they saw that the skier had no face. The two guys fell off their skis and ran as fast as they could, away. They looked over their shoulder and saw the faceless skier getting up and disappearing into the storm. The two skiers never saw the faceless skier again, but many others reported seeing them on the mountain. No one knows who they are or where they go, but some say they can be seen on the darkest nights skiing down the mountain in the moonlight. Moving on, let's look at Frozen in time. A young girl was walking home one day when she realized she was lost. She was alone, and the sun was beginning to set. She started to panic, but then she spotted a house in the distance. She raced toward it, desperate for help. When she got to the front door, she knocked, but there was no answer. She tried the handle and it was unlocked. She stepped inside and called for help. Nobody answered. She knew she was alone, but she was exhausted and needed a place to rest. She walked upstairs and found a bedroom. She climbed into the bed and fell asleep, but she was awakened by a scratching sound. It was coming from the closet. She screamed and hid under the covers until the noise stopped. When she finally got up the courage to open the closet door, she was shocked. There was nothing in there. She looked around the room and saw a drawing on the wall. It was a picture of a family. She walked downstairs and saw another drawing. It showed the same family, but there was one more person in it. It was a tall, thin man with sharp teeth. She walked into the kitchen and saw another picture. The family was standing in front of the house. The tall man was with them, but there was also a new addition. The young girl stared in disbelief. The tall man had a meat cleaver in his hand. The last drawing showed the family with their throats slit. The girl was terrified. Who was this man? What had happened to the family? She didn't know, but she needed to get out of there. She ran to the door and escaped. When the police searched the house, they found something shocking. The house had been empty for years, but there was one thing that had been overlooked. There was a single footprint in the dust. It was a size 14 work boot. The police still don't know who left the print, but some say it's the ghost of the man with the meat cleaver. Next, we have to look at the wind howls a name. A family was relaxing in their home one day when they heard a knock at the door. They ignored it, thinking it was just the wind. But then they heard it again. Knock, knock. The family looked at each other. They lived in the middle of nowhere, and nobody ever visited them. They checked outside, but there was no one there. The family decided to ignore it and went back to what they were doing. But then the knocking started again. Knock, knock. They looked at each other in fear. They had to do something. They opened the door and looked outside, but once again, there was no one there. The wind was blowing hard and the family shut the door. They locked it this time, but then they heard a whisper outside. The family gasped as they heard their names being whispered in the wind. They waited, but then they heard it again. This time, it was louder. "Get away," it said. The family huddled together in fear. They heard the knock at the door again. This time it was louder than ever. They refused to answer, but then the knocking stopped. The family waited, but then they heard a voice. "Let me in, or I'll break the door down." They were terrified, but what could they do? They called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. The family was forced to stay in their home for 3 weeks until the mysterious knocking and whispering stopped. Finally, we have to look at the car that never left. A woman was driving through a small town one day when her car broke down. She pulled over and got out to see what she could do. She popped the hood and looked around. She was in the middle of nowhere, and the closest gas station was about 10 miles away. Just then, a tow truck came barreling down the road. The driver offered to help her, but she declined and said she'd wait for a ride. The tow truck driver warned her not to stay there too long, but she insisted she would be fine. As the sun began to set, she started to panic. She had been waiting for hours and no one had come to help. She tried to flag down passing cars, but they all seemed to be moving in slow motion. She was trapped. Finally, she decided to take the tow truck's advice and called for help. When the police arrived, they found a grim sight. The woman was slumped over the steering wheel. Her car had been stuck in the mud for so long that it had become a tomb. They called in a tow truck to remove the car, but as they lifted it up, they made a gruesome discovery. Inside the car, they found the skeletal remains of the driver. The police had finally solved the mystery of the car that never left. Thank you for watching. Which of these stories was the most terrifying to you? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to hear more scary stories, check out more content. But for now, I've been your host. And remember, some doors are best left unopened.